Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the May webinar for the Healer Training Program. Good to see some familiar faces on there and some new ones as well. I have a few quick announcements. We'll jump into some research updates and then field lots of good questions that came through. So the announcements. First of all, we've added a resource center to the training program. And so to access that, you click on the paperclip in the top right corner. All of the Healer certified guides and the webinar library link are located in that resource center, and we're going to continually add more resources to it. So check out the resource center. Certifications were processed and sent out on Friday. So if you completed the course and you haven't received them yet, just email training@healer.com and we'll make sure to get your certificate to you. The March webinar recording is now posted in the webinar library. So for those of you that didn't get to attend March, it was a good one. You can check it out in the webinar library. And finally, the same update that I've sadly been giving for a few months now about the new CBD curriculum I've been working on. It's not quite done yet. I've had a lot on my plate here, and I want to make sure it's great before I publish it on the site, but you can expect that soon, a whole nother chapter, or so to speak, in the curriculum focused just on CBD, because we've had so many requests for that. And of course, there's lots of good CBD content that's embedded in the webinars, and all the webinars have a time table on them where you can just fast forward right to the point that you want to listen to an interesting question or one of the studies that I've presented. So let's dig into the material. I hope you've all had a really nice day. I had a great one here in the clinic today. Saw a lot of patients, many of which had gotten a lot better with cannabis. It's just such rewarding work that we do. Well then, let's get to the slides. Okay, do we have slides and video and sound all together?
Yep.
Excellent. So tonight I chose 5 studies, 4 of which were just published in the last month or so, and one a little older because we had a couple requests for my comments on a study that showed that cannabis was not effective for chronic pain, which is probably a big surprise to you all. And this was a very large meta-analysis. And so besides a couple requests for my comments on that, I was co-presenting with someone at a Midwest Osteopathic conference this past week. The other presenter was not very much in favor of cannabis and was very quick to highlight all the problems with it. And she also brought up this study. So I thought I would dig in and read it thoroughly, read all the supplemental material, and give you my opinion on it. Then there was, just to lighten things up a little bit, a bit of data that came out about cannabis and the female orgasm, some additional data about cannabis and dementia, and that body of evidence continues to grow. Cannabis, alcohol abuse, and inflammation, just a very narrow perspective of that issue, even though I think there's a much broader discussion that we might have about it. And then endoscopic sedation requirements in cannabis users, maybe a little practical tip that could be used by cannabis users if they're going in for a colonoscopy or an endoscopy. So let's start with this article published in October 2018 in the journal Pain. And one of the conclusions in the paper, as well as the abstract, it appears unlikely that cannabinoids are highly effective medicines for chronic non-cancer pain. Surprising conclusion, considering how many of us know people that have very effectively used cannabis for pain. Many of us have used it ourselves. Many other review articles that say it is effective. So what was different about this study? Well, first of all, these authors were trying to do something quite difficult, and that was combine every bit of data that they could find. So not only randomized controlled trials, but also observational studies. They basically looked at every category of data that they could find with cannabis or cannabinoids, synthetic cannabinoids, and so forth being used for chronic non-cancer pain. In all of their studies, and there were, over 104 total, 100 of them were looking at pain intensity, and then 81 adverse events, and 71 withdrawal symptoms. Fewer studies reported on outcomes that are actually more important than pain intensity, like physical functioning, emotional functioning, patient's global impression of change. This means if you ask the patient, has this improved the quality of your life? Has this helped you via a questionnaire? The answer is yes or no. And those are actually the functional outcomes that we're striving to achieve when we treat people with chronic pain. We care about their quality of life. We care about their ability to participate in life, interact with their families, and go to work and so forth. So fewer of the studies looked at those outcomes. So the author said that we found moderate evidence for a reduction in pain for cannabinoids when compared to placebo. So even, and that's a quote, so just looking at that statement, interesting that that's in the paper, even though in the abstract and in the conclusion, as you can see, it appears unlikely that cannabinoids are highly effective for chronic non-cancer pain. Well, maybe they think they're moderately effective. So there's moderate evidence for reduction in pain compared to placebo. 30% reduction in pain is a very common mark to look at in pain studies. And that was reported by 29% of people in the cannabinoid group compared with about 26% in the placebo group. So not a big difference between the cannabinoid group and the placebo group, but a pretty big effect anyways. 30% of people that try this have a 30% reduction in pain. That's a fairly effective pain drug there. NNTB is number needed to benefit. So the number needed to benefit to achieve a 30% reduction in pain for one person using cannabis or cannabinoids compared to placebo, not just in general, but compared to placebo, was estimated at 24. So if you give cannabis to 24 more people than you give a placebo to, then you're likely to have one person that responds better to the cannabis than to the placebo. The number needed to harm for one person to experience any adverse event was 6. And they say any adverse event. So these aren't serious adverse events. This is something like feeling a little dizzy or having dry mouth would be considered harm. And so 1 out of 6 people experience some harm using that definition. So you can see the way these authors kind of painted this picture to make it look like cannabis was more dangerous, easier to harm people with it, and harder to achieve benefits with it. The authors noted that most of the higher quality randomized controlled trial evidence was for neuropathic pain and MS related pain. And of course, if you know the treatment of pain, that type of pain is notoriously the most difficult to treat, neuropathic pain. Now, it's been my experience in my clinical practice, and I think in many others, that while many types of drugs fail to treat neuropathic pain, cannabis is actually a pretty good treatment for that type of pain. And one of the reasons for that is that the effect of cannabis on chronic pain is not limited to the intensity of the pain. Cannabis doesn't just make the pain less intense, and I think many of you know this. It changes the pain in many ways, especially changes our response to the pain. This is called the affective, starting with an A, affective component of pain, which is basically after the pain signal reaches the brain and we interpret it as pain, it then goes into the limbic system, which is the part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and memories. And cannabis seems to make the pain a lot less bothersome. It changes how anxious we become when we have the pain, changes our overall response to the pain. And that's quite hard to measure on a pain intensity scale. It usually doesn't show up there, but it does show up in quality of life measures. The authors also concluded that there is scant low quality evidence on cannabinoids used for fibromyalgia or visceral pain, and very few studies of cannabinoids use in the most common burdensome chronic non-cancer pain conditions, namely back and neck problems, migraines, and arthritis. So So here there's this headline and these sweeping conclusions saying cannabis probably isn't effective for chronic non-cancer pain. But if you read the article, they say, well, the most common types of chronic non-cancer pain, we don't even have much data on that. And so they do admit that the conclusions of this review primarily relate to neuropathic or MS related pain, but you have to really dig into the paper to find these sentences, and it's quite a large paper. Now, this is from some of the supplemental material, and I think this is actually nice to take a look at. So this is a forest plot of just the randomized controlled study evidence for the impact on pain using 30% reduction in pain intensity as a cutoff. And you can see up at the top here, we have neuropathic pain, and down at the bottom, this is just chronic non-cancer pain, and then a total here. And so anything to the right of this black vertical line is a beneficial effect, meaning cannabis was more effective than placebo. Anything that crosses the line would be a non-significant finding, not statistically significant, and anything to the left of the line shows that it was not helpful or maybe even made the pain worse. And so you can see here that many of these randomized controlled studies were leaning to the right, and the average or subtotal of them showed a statistically significant beneficial effect on this 30% cutoff for reduction of pain. And then we also have two studies that, when averaged here for other types of chronic non-cancer pain, also showed a benefit. And here's the total with an odds ratio of 1.46, which means about 46% more likely to work if using cannabis compared to placebo. You know, we can see similar results for other measures. This, for example, is the global impression of change, basically how a patient feels like they're doing. And you can see that these studies, these three studies, were very far to the right, showing that the cannabis group did better. There was one study over here using just a THC extract that was a non-significant finding. And so the total average was a very strong improvement in global impression of change, though the authors did not emphasize that in the main text. And then also here's another one. This is another outcome related to global impression of change, also beneficial. And then over here, now on this chart, to the left of the vertical line shows a benefit from the cannabis group, and to the right shows no benefit or benefit to the control group. And so this is overall emotional functioning. And so you can see most things are leaning towards cannabis, as well as the total showing a benefit for overall functioning, also not emotional functioning, also not emphasized by the authors in their conclusions. So that's interesting, you know, just to really dig into the studies. I will say that this was such a huge endeavor to go through all of these studies, figure out which ones qualified with their criteria. Did they weigh them appropriately? Did they control for them appropriately? Many opportunities for mistakes or for intentional changes, you know, that would create an outcome that served the authors or the authors' employers. And I'm not saying, I'm not stating that these authors had any malintent other than purely reporting science to the best of their interest, you know, their best of their ability. Hopefully that's the case. It's not always the case in scientific publications, and that's why all these publications are required to report conflicts of interest from the authors. So three of the authors were paid by grants from a company called Reckitt Benckiser, and I wasn't familiar with that company, so I looked it up, and I'll show you what I found. Also, three of these authors were paid by grants funded by Indivior, also not very familiar with that company, but I looked them up. And then finally, two of the authors supported by a grant from a company that did post-marketing surveillance studies of reformulated OxyContin. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that this paper is not valid. But I will say that one of those companies was being scrutinized in Australia for their pain med ads. Basically, and this was just kind of the first thing that popped up when I searched for them. They intentionally misled customers to think different products produce different kinds of pain relief, ailment-specific products such as Nurofen pain, migraine pain cost almost twice as much as the regular product, but they contain the same ingredient. So maybe not the most honest and direct marketing. And then this other company, just this month, a UK drug maker stock crashed 80% after it was indicted for a truly shameful opioid addiction scheme, where they basically advertised the Suboxone film, its blockbuster opioid addiction treatment, as being far superior to other forms of Suboxone. But that was clearly not the case. So you always have to wonder about some of these things. So, and what have other studies concluded about cannabis for non-cancer chronic pain? Well, here was a really large review from the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 2015. They found that there was moderate quality evidence to support the use of cannabinoids for the treatment of chronic pain and spasticity. And that was their first conclusion. If you look at this review article, from 2015. They evaluated 11 gold standard randomized controlled trials that were published between 2010 and 2014, found that 7 out of those 11 demonstrated the cannabinoid was better than the control group, whether it was placebo or some other control, at treating chronic non-cancer pain, and that those findings were consistent with a previous review article. And when you put all those studies together, these are 29 randomized controlled trials, gold standard studies. 22 out of the 29 showed a benefit in non-cancer chronic pain. And then, of course, our federal government's National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Health and Medicine Division released this 2017 report. I know a lot of you are familiar with it. And they also concluded that there is substantial evidence that cannabis is an effective treatment for chronic pain in adults. So I hope that I've given you some ability to contest this 2018 Pain Journal article that said it's not effective for chronic pain. I mean, really, if you just read the article, it actually says that it is effective for chronic pain, but don't believe all the headlines. So let's, and then, just going a little bit deeper into what came out of that National Academy of Sciences report. In their review, the committee found that only a handful of studies have evaluated the use of cannabis in the United States, and all of them evaluated cannabis in flower form provided by the National Institute of Drug Abuse that was either vaporized or smoked. In contrast, many of the cannabis products that are sold in state-regulated markets bear little resemblance to the products that are available for research. Why? The research products typically don't get very much above 5% THC per weight of the flower. It's very low quality flower. So any of the studies on herbal cannabis, smoked or vaporized, that have come out of National Institute of Drug Abuse research supply have not been reflective of what we're using and what our patients and friends and customers are using. It's quite different. So thus, while the use of cannabis for the treatment of pain is supported by well-controlled clinical trials as reviewed above, very little is known about the efficacy, dose, routes of administration, or side effects of commonly used and commercially available cannabis products in the United States. That last statement is well known and well acknowledged amongst the cannabis research community, but it was not mentioned in that 2018 review article published in the Journal of Pain. So another thing that they overlooked. All right, let's lighten it up a bit. The relationship between cannabis use prior to sex and sexual function in women. This was a cross-sectional design at an OB-GYN practice in St. Louis, Missouri, at the University School of Medicine. Patients were given a questionnaire at their visit, asked to complete it anonymously and place it in a locked box after the visit. The primary outcome was satisfaction in the sexual domains of drive, orgasm, lubrication, dyspareunia, which is pain with intercourse, and overall sexual experience. So women who reported cannabis use before sexual activity had 2.13 times higher odds of reporting satisfactory orgasms than women who reported no marijuana use. Women with frequent marijuana use, regardless of use before sex or not, had 2.1 times higher odds of reporting satisfactory orgasms than those with infrequent use. So just frequent cannabis users, cannabis using women in general, had more satisfactory orgasms, and those who used it before sex had even higher odds of reporting satisfactory orgasms. Among those who reported using cannabis before sex, 68.5% said the overall sexual experience was more pleasurable. 60% noted an increase in sex drive. 52% reported an increase in satisfying orgasms. The majority reported no change in lubrication, which is interesting because I wouldn't expect cannabis to help with vaginal lubrication. In fact, sometimes it can interfere with vaginal lubrication, just like it can cause dry mouth by suppressing the secretion of some of those glands. It can do the same thing in the vagina. On the other hand, it can increase arousal, and that would then lead to higher rates or levels of lubrication. So I think the lubrication effect can go in both directions, and that's probably why there was no clear trend in that finding. So what's the take-home message here? Probably that women, and certainly other data shows that it's more likely to work for women than it is for men. Men have more mixed results with cannabis use before sex, and it's probably dose dependent, but it seems like women who use cannabis before sex may be able to achieve more satisfaction, more pleasure, better orgasms. With men, I think the real risk is using so much cannabis that they become sedated or distracted, and probably keeping the dose very low before sex would also be helpful for men. All right, let's switch gears again to dementia. This was a prescription of a THC and CBD based medication to patients with dementia in Geneva, Switzerland. And this was an observational study on 10 female demented patients with severe behavioral problems in a nursing home that specialized in that type of care. They were given a cannabis oil that was basically a 2-to-1 ratio, using our typical nomenclature with CBD first and THC second. So 2 parts CBD, 1 part THC, and they were given it 3 times daily. And you can see these dosages down at the bottom. This is the total daily dose. So you could divide it by 3 to get the individual dose. They were given it 3 times daily. And so at the end of 2 weeks, the average dose was 7.6 milligrams of THC and about twice as much CBD. After a month, the dose went up a little bit from there. And after 2 months, it went up a little bit more. So they ended up with 9 milligrams of THC and 18 milligrams of CBD total daily. So that would be 3 milligrams of CBD and 6 milligrams, 3 milligrams of THC and 6 milligrams of CBD given 3 times daily. Not a very high dose. They completed neuropsychiatric inventories, agitation scales, behavior problem scales, and what they found was that there was an overall decrease in all of these scales by around 40% at the end of 2 months. So symptoms improved drastically in 2 months. Rigidity scores decreased by 50% after 2 months. So this has to do with their movement, how rigid they are. And half of the patients decreased or stopped other psychotropic medications during this 2-month period. The staff appreciated the now this is the qualitative stuff, which I think is really important. Gives context to the nature of this problem. We have so many of our elders that really deserve great care, respect, and love that are in facilities where they're not able to receive all of that. The staff appreciated the decrease in rigidity, making daily care and transfers easier. The improved direct contact with the patients, the improvement in behavior, and the decrease in constipation with less opioids. Those were all things that were noted. There was no withholding of the cannabis medication for reasons of side effects. The benefits persisted over the course of 2 months. They described the patients as calmer, more relaxed, less irritable, and smiling more. The 2 women with persistent screaming almost stopped doing so, which was a major relief for other patients and the staff. And of course, what's the alternative treatment in these patients? It's drugs that are known to be very harmful to the elderly, typically found on something called the Beers list, which is a list of medications that are usually avoided in the elderly because there's strong evidence showing that their use is related to increased death and increased risk of other harm. And those are the antipsychotics and the benzodiazepines. And that's the category of drugs that cannabis tends to spare in this population. So not only is it helping with their symptoms and quality of life, but it's really reducing their risk for these negative outcomes that they have an increased risk of when they're using these other classes of medications. Now, that's the symptoms. And we have several of these small studies that talk about cannabis really helping the symptoms of people living in dementia care units. And I certainly see this in my practice. I have several patients that live in assisted living and nursing home facilities that are using cannabis or synthetic cannabinoids with great results. And they also improve their quality of life, and they get off their other drugs, everything that you've heard about here. But what about the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's itself? What about the disease process? Well, we have quite a bit of information from animal studies showing that cannabis is likely, or certainly does in animals, and it's likely in humans, to directly address the cause and the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease and probably other forms of dementia as well. So the cannabinoids have been shown to increase the availability of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that we make, and reduced levels of acetylcholine are associated with progression and worsening symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And the goal of our current Alzheimer's drugs is to increase acetylcholine availability. The cannabinoids have also been shown to reduce amyloid plaques. Now, these amyloid plaques are something that's been generated by the brain in response to either infection or diabetes or some type of other insult that's causing inflammation. So the plaques can actually serve a protective and healthy role in certain situations. But the problem in Alzheimer's is that these plaques build up, and they build up to the point where they start impairing function. The cannabinoids also reduce oxidative stress, neuroinflammation, and apoptosis, which is the cell death that's evoked by these beta amyloid plaques. The cannabinoids regulate the NMDA receptor, which is a glutamate receptor that's thought to be responsible for the progression, or partially responsible for the progression of Alzheimer's. And cannabinoids stimulate neural progenitor proliferation and neurogenesis. This means that the cannabinoids help the body build new neurons and make new connections between the neurons, which is, of course, very important in Alzheimer's disease. So, I just wanted to review a few older headlines here. This was a study from 2006, THC inhibits beta amyloid aggregation, more effective than the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. These are the drugs that we're currently using to treat Alzheimer's, and this would be very important in preventing the progression of the disease. A study from 2017 in mice that I think some of you have probably heard about, but this was really profound because it showed that you could give a moderate dose of THC, 3 milligrams per kilogram per day, to older mice that had cognitive decline, and show that after 28 days of treatment, number one, the number of neural connections in a critical area called the hippocampus had increased, and that their gene transcription patterns of THC treated mice resembled the younger mice, and they were able to reverse cognitive decline. So they improved their cognitive function after they had already declined. This reversal is pretty profound. And most geriatrics specialists that you talk to would tell you we don't have anything that can do this in people once they experience cognitive decline. At best, we're going to just halt the progression of this and hopefully avoid dementia. Or once they have mild dementia, hopefully it doesn't progress to the more advanced stages of dementia. And that's what the current pharmacotherapies are designed to do. But I do want to point out, not a lot of people know about this, but that is not the case, that we're unable to do that in people. And even without using cannabis, it's been very clearly shown that with a programmatic approach, meaning this isn't based on a single drug or a single herb, this is a complex evaluation followed by an integrative medicine or functional medicine treatment, that's tailored to the individual, that you absolutely can reverse cognitive decline. And this is the third study published by Dale Bredesen and colleagues. This one came out last year in 2018 that looked at 100 patients who were able to reverse their cognitive decline. And this author suggests something called a cognoscopy, which is a play on the term colonoscopy. It's a cognoscopy, which is basically an in-depth evaluation that he thinks everyone should get at age 45 before they start to have cognitive decline, to evaluate their genetics and many other functional markers, including their cognitive tests, blood work, and so forth, and then get on a program that can absolutely help. And a lot of it has to do with diet and lifestyle. So cannabis is great for people with dementia. It's very clearly proven to help with the symptoms of dementia. It's very likely that it could be a component of addressing the underlying cause of dementia and helping to heal that. But please, if you have someone with dementia and their families are motivated, or if you know, for example, that you carry the ApoE gene, or you carry two copies of the ApoE4, it's the ApoE4 version that's associated with higher risk of Alzheimer's, and you're worried about it, you know that you're at higher risk to get this disease, and you want to do something about it, I really strongly encourage you to look into Dale Bredesen's work. I think it's quite on the cutting edge, and cannabis would be a nice adjunct to that. Okay, moving on. Investigating the relationship between alcohol consumption, cannabis use, and circulating cytokines, a preliminary analysis. And this was done in people. So altered inflammatory signaling is one mechanism underlying the pathophysiology of all alcohol use disorders, because alcohol binds to receptors on immune cells and it triggers signaling pathways that produce inflammation. And then that inflammation could cause more harm to the nervous system and cause an acceleration of the detrimental effects of alcohol, and including behavioral effects that might drive people to continue drinking instead of stop drinking, even though they know it's harmful to them. So this study evaluated self-reported alcohol and cannabis use and circulating levels of these inflammatory messengers in the body in 66 regular drinkers. And what they found was that, and I just picked out the key points that I think are relevant to this conversation. Individuals who did not report cannabis use demonstrated a significant positive association between their alcohol consumption and IL-6, which is a kind of a notorious cytokine. It's an inflammatory signal in the body that's associated with much more than just alcohol abuse or alcohol use. It's associated with many rheumatoid conditions, Lyme disease. It's one of the bad actors in chronic inflammation. And the people who used cannabis with their alcohol showed no association between the alcohol use and IL-6. Now, other studies have also shown that cannabis use is inversely related to the production of IL-6. And so cannabis has some anti-inflammatory effects by suppressing this mediator. These authors said these results also highlight the need for future work exploring the potential role for cannabinoids such as THC and CBD as anti-inflammatory treatments in the context of alcohol use disorders. And so I think that's a nice statement, and a bit of a segue to something I want to wrap around to after this last statement, after this last study that we can look at here, because one of our participants tonight is currently involved in a CBD study related to alcohol use. And so I'll invite Dr. Stewart to comment on what he's working on after this next one. So the effects of cannabis use on sedation requirements for endoscopic procedures. This was a study published in the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association. 250 medical records were reviewed from one endoscopy center in rural Colorado with one endoscopist. So that was to minimize variability in sedation techniques amongst different practitioners. And out of those 250, 25 were self-reported cannabis users. So this is not a very powerful study with only 25 versus 225. But still, this might be an important clue. Regular cannabis users required more sedation for their procedures. And the statistical significance persisted when adjusted for age, sex, the use of alcohol, benzodiazepines, and opiates. So it seemed like this was a valid signal that was coming on. So you can see how much fentanyl did they need. The cannabis users needed more than double, almost triple the amount of fentanyl as the non-cannabis users. Not something that we would expect, considering how we all know that cannabinoids can potentiate opioids like fentanyl. I have no mechanistic explanation for that. Midazolam, even if it was a pharmacokinetic interaction with the cytochrome P450 system in the liver, I don't think we would see a tripling of the required dose. Midazolam, which is Versed, that's a sedative. You can see cannabis users needed a little bit more. And then propofol, which is an anesthetic, cannabis users needed quite a bit more. So this is not conclusive evidence, but I think this is enough for regular cannabis users to mention to the person who's doing their endoscopy that they use cannabis and that they may need more sedation than typical non-cannabis users, but it's a big maybe. It's certainly not for sure. Hopefully we'll have some more data in the future to help confirm or disprove these findings. So that is the end of my slideshow. Why don't we just have, if we could have Dr. Stewart just comment on what he's doing. If you'd like to just take a few minutes about to explain a little bit about your research project, and if you need our help in any ways, or just tell us what you're up to.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, the research project that I'm involved with is with an addiction treatment center in the Palm Springs area. And we're looking at a 4-arm study. We're in the process of writing the study right now. So we're not in the middle of doing the study. We've identified the treatment center, and the owners of the treatment center are on board with us, as is their medical director. We'll be using cannabis products that meet the criteria for industrial hemp, so that actually stay legal in all 50 states. The product's produced in Colorado, but it will be used in California. So we'll have a control group. We'll also have a placebo group. We will have a group that will be getting just a CBD isolate, and then we'll be having a group that will be getting the full cannabis flower extract. So it will have all the cannabinoids and terpenes. It will have less than 0.3% THC. We're looking at about a 20-to-1 CBD to THC ratio. And then our particular strain that we want to use is going to be one that's high in beta-caryophyllene as well. I believe there's evidence to support that beta-caryophyllene may be helpful in the addiction setting as well. And so we're excited. It's a fairly small study because we're a small company and we don't have a whole lot of funding to do this type of thing yet. And we are also in the discussion of what labs we will and won't be able to, afford to add on. And IL-6 is one that comes to mind right now, which is why I enjoy being a part of, these discussions here. I understand there's not a lot as far as the addictionologists are concerned. There's not a lot of hard evidence that they can point to be able to use cannabis products in this setting, and we're just hoping that we come up with some information that will be supportive of it. My bias is that whole plant works better than isolates do, so my suspicion is we're going to find that the whole plant product is going to be more effective than the CBD isolate, which we expect will be more effective than the placebo, which we expect will be more effective than the control. But, give us a few months now, and I'm hoping that we'll be actively involved in the study by the end of the month.
Great. Thank you for doing this. This is exactly what we need. I mean, it's, as people talk about the potential harms of adult illicit use cannabis, or even adult legal use cannabis, I think it's so easy for them to skim over the problem of alcohol abuse in our world. It's such a huge problem. And thank you for digging into this. I've got a couple questions. One is, what treatment is the control treatment? And the second one is, what's the dosing range on CBD that you think you'll be using?
The dosing range on the CBD is going to be somewhere between 50 to 100 milligrams, and we're looking at BID dosing. What your first question?
Oh, the
Sorry.
control, is it compared to another treatment for control, or just?
No, we're just, we're just have a group that we're following that isn't going to get anything, but they're going to have the same questionnaires and the same labs that we'll be doing. And then of course the placebo, so it's just a control group of folks that we monitor the same way we do everybody else.
Got it. Great. All right. Well, thank you, Michael, for telling us about that. I'm sure we all wish you great success, and hopefully it'll lead to more study on this topic, because there's been way too little, and hopefully we'll see more.
Well, I'm looking forward to sharing it as soon as we have it available.
Yeah, please. Okay, I'm going to just field a few things that came through in the chat before I get to the questions that were submitted ahead of time. One was just asking me, I think a lot of questions. Yes, all of this content will be available in the Healer training program, but the dosages used in that dementia study. So these were, remember, 10 female dementia patients, and men may respond differently, but they were using 3 milligrams of THC and 6 milligrams of CBD 3 times a day. They didn't start there, but that's how they worked up to that dose at the end of 2 months. And it looks like we had another question about dementia. Is beta amyloid progression, does it have an origin in gut flora? Well, there's absolutely a bacterial component, or I should not even just bacterial, infectious. Various viruses and bacteria have been associated with the pathophysiology of dementia. I don't want to say causative, but probably a contributing factor. And you can find all sorts of bacteria in the brains on autopsy of people with dementia bacteria that we wouldn't want to be there. Things like Lyme disease, things like oral flora, people that have higher levels of some of the bacteria strains that cause acne, some of the herpes simplex viruses, there's a number of them. And actually the beta amyloid plaques, those can be helpful at fighting these infections. And so they're not bad per se. The problem is when they build up too much and they accumulate because there's a chronic infection that's ongoing and not ending. And then that ends up reducing the function of the nervous system. We do have one anecdote from Joanne saying that she's been underdosed, that she has higher sedation requirements. And so that adds to some of that data that we saw on the slide. And I think that looks good. Let's head over to some of the pre-submitted questions. But I love taking your live questions. So if anyone has a live question, just send a message to Simone or to the group, which is like the equivalent of raising your hand, and we would be very happy to get you unmuted so that you can ask your live question. But okay. Let's start with a couple live ones then. Go ahead, Simone.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi guys. It's been a minute since I saw you. Hi, Dr. Sulak. How are you? So recently, I have been diagnosed with MS, and I work in the medical cannabis community. But I was recently diagnosed with brain cancer. So I've obviously been treating my brain cancer with cannabis. I'm doing the RSO oil. But doing the RSO oil, Dr. Sulak, I've run into a little bit of problems. I've found that I have a lot of MCT oil in my CBD. It was causing me some tummy issues, but I fixed it. My question for you, or comment to you, is in this journey that I've taken with the RSO, I've noticed a cognition issue, but I fixed it. So what I did was I had a massive issue with my memory to the point where I couldn't remember what I was going to say by the time I opened my mouth. So I got scared. It's never happened to me before. So I did some research and I ended up taking myself off of the CBD tincture and keeping RSO. took myself off of the CBD tincture and used CBD isolate instead. I was a little bit nervous doing this because I wasn't quite sure what my reaction was going to be because I do so well with CBD with my MS. It's actually been unbelievably awesome. I've done very, very well, which I was quite shocked. I wasn't quite sure which way we were going to go. My memory is getting way better. My recall is even better than it was before. So that's positive. I was a little bit concerned by losing memory that I may have to back off the cannabis. So basically, I was listening to a little bit of the conversation. I know that we're talking about CBD isolates, and somebody had mentioned that. My concern was it's dried up. It's not the real flower part of it. Am I getting what I need to from the CBD isolate?
Well, okay, so those are interesting comments. It sounds like there was something in the CBD extract, the whole plant extract, that was bothering you. That was maybe not the CBD itself, but something that was there with the CBD. You know, perhaps some terpenes, maybe some other plant constituents, but maybe some non-plant constituents like toxins, solvents, something else that you don't want, right? I'm not sure what product you were using, and if you had lab testing results on that product to know just how clean it was and if it was accurately labeled. There's just so many unknowns in some of these treatments that it's hard to know for sure. Do you have any response to that before I go on? My other comment in response is that I have absolutely seen people that have done better with CBD isolate compared to whole plant CBD in terms of the side effects. And the most common thing that I hear is that the whole plant CBD feels sedating, whereas the CBD isolate is non-sedating, more awakening and alerting. And again, that has very little to do with the CBD. It's more likely due to some of the other compounds, particularly the more sedating terpenes, like many of the CBD varieties out there have a lot of myrcene, which would be sedating. And so in that case, I absolutely do know people that prefer taking the isolate to the whole plant. Now, you know, the second question that's I think less relevant is, would the isolate have less of an anti-cancer effect compared to the whole plant CBD?
Right.
Well, I think there's two reasons why that's a less relevant question. One is that if you can't tolerate the whole plant, then it's not going to help you. We don't even have to talk about it. You simply can't tolerate it. It's not worth you having that type of a quality of life detriment. But the other aspect is, it sounds like you're also using some whole plant extract of THC. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm using generally they're indica strains. You mean the syringes that I'm using for the ASO?
Yeah, so basically what I was just getting at is you're still getting other plant components. It's not like you're using just a single molecule, which is something that I would
Right.
probably say, based on the evidence we have, a combination of compounds found in cannabis is likely going to have more anti-cancer effects than a single compound. And you are getting a combination, even though on the CBD side, you've narrowed it down to just a single compound. On the THC side, you're still getting more of a spectrum of compounds.
Yeah. How do you, I mean, I felt better. I don't mean physically felt better. I just mean I felt better knowing that I was taking CBD in the liquid form, from my dispensary. I felt better about that than I do about, I'm not trying to knock anybody who takes it, just a powder form to me doesn't seem natural in my body. Do you know what I mean? And I wasn't quite sure. I guess I'm asking about how pure is it that I'm putting in my body? Like, how much extra stuff am I adding?
These are questions that a good lab could answer for you.
Okay.
There was another report this last month. I think those of you that were on, I believe it was last webinar, when I reviewed some of the evidence showing that less than half the CBD products on the market are what they say they are. Many of them are contaminated or adulterated.
Right.
You never know what you're getting, whether it's an isolate powder or a so-called full plant extract. And that's a problem. So I think it's, if you're going to do something where it's really important, like treat your MS and treat cancer, then absolutely you need third-party verification. I wouldn't.
Oh yeah, we do because I get mine at my dispensary, so we definitely do have. You can check back on the lineage of where it comes from for sure.
Okay, good.
It's nice. Plus, I've gotten to see, what we do and how it's made and stuff. So
Okay.
that does make me feel better. But
Well, I'm sure you have our whole community sending you love and support. God willing, one of these webinars will have you on, and your story will be similar to Nicole's story with breast cancer, who we heard from last time. And I'm really glad that you're part of this community, and I want to support you in whatever way we can during your treatment.
you guys have been amazing already. Everything has been awesome.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining. Okay, I'm going to jump to some of the previously submitted questions. So this is from Amalthea. I have been invited to speak to a tremor support group about CBD, and I wonder what Dr. Sulak or those in this group have experienced with people with tremors. Has anyone seen CBD to be effective? THC, the acid forms, what works best? I've also heard that Parkinson's patients have a higher tolerance for THC and need higher doses. So my experience with tremor is primarily with THC. And I've seen that even quite low doses of THC in some people can have a notable improvement in tremor of various types. And there also is some evidence in the literature to support this. Certainly in MS and a little bit also in Parkinson's disease. And so I suspect that CBD could be effective in some people and maybe the acidic forms as well. But my main bet for tremor, or my first line approach, would be THC. Now, as far as Parkinson's goes and having a higher tolerance, I would say that there's a trend of that in my practice. Not everyone, but probably more often than not. Patients with Parkinson's need a little bit of a higher dose than other people. But I wouldn't just assume that. You still start low, go slow, and don't be afraid to go all the way. One of the things with Parkinson's that's important to know is that some of the evidence that we have shows that the condition may be slower to respond to cannabis. So it's quite easy to find benefits in sleep, benefits in pain, benefits in mood, and so forth. That can all happen in the first week or two. And then it's sometimes after they continue using cannabis at that dose that helps those other symptoms for 2 to 3 months. And then at that time, they start showing improvements in their Parkinson's symptoms. And there is some older data out of the Czech Republic that confirms those observations. Okay, so another one, when a cancer patient is following the RSO protocol and dosing orally, has it been found to be more effective if it's taken by itself or mixed with an oil like coconut or olive oil? In other words, is RSO absorbed if mixed with the oil due to it attaching to fat? What's your opinion on feeling and how it should be consumed? So a couple points there. When we are absorbing something through the oral mucosa, so through the blood vessels in the mouth, it's likely going to be absorbed best if it's at a higher concentration, because there'll be more of a concentration gradient to push it across that barrier into the capillaries. And so if someone's taking RSO, for example, and putting a little bit of it between their lip and their cheek, then I believe that the full potency, if it doesn't burn their mouth or cause an irritation, would probably be best absorbed. Now, when we're taking cannabis and absorbing it through the gut, then it's best to take it not only with fat, but with a high-fat meal. It might be a little bit better absorbed if it's dissolved in some oil, but it'll be best absorbed if when that oil is in the gut, it meets with our bile acids. And so by eating a meal, then that turns on our digestion, stimulates the gallbladder to secrete the bile. That bile mixes with these fatty substances, and that's what really improves the absorbability. And this was shown in a study that we covered in a recent webinar looking at CBD, where it was absorbed about 6 times better when taken in a capsule form with a high-fat meal compared to taken on an empty stomach. So hopefully that explains it. You know, I think that using cannabis concentrates, like a hash oil type of a concentrate, is something that a lot of people are doing. A lot of people make mistakes with it and take too much. For patients that are determined to do this, one suggestion that I've had for them, and maybe some of you have heard me tell this before, get a very sensitive scale, put a little piece of rice paper, edible rice paper on the scale, zero it out, and then you can smear a little bit of that cannabis tar onto the rice paper and get a weight that you're looking for, so you can have an accurate dose and then gradually increase that dose over time. Then you can just fold up that piece of rice paper and stick it in your mouth. The rice paper dissolves, and over time you get exposure of the cannabis to the oral mucosa. So that's one strategy. All right, if you guys have live questions, just tell Simone, and I'll encourage her to jump in when they pop up, but I'll just continue on. I've been noticing 2 new cannabis products at the dispensary I go to in California, CBG and Delta 8. What are the benefits? What do they do? I was told CBG is good for bone growth and digestive tract issues. Delta 8 is a milder high, which I found not to be true, even with cutting the tab way down. Your thoughts? So I'll speak to the CBG issue first. I think CBG is a very interesting cannabinoid, and so is CBGA. I would expect CBG to behave more like CBD than it would THC, because CBG does not appear to have much activity at the CB1 receptor, but it does affect several of the other receptors that CBD affects, like the TRPV1 capsaicin receptor, the TRPA1 receptor. It inhibits the uptake of several neurotransmitters. So CBG may function like CBD and may be more potent than CBD. I have a colleague in California, Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, who has been updating me on her results with CBG. And it seems like in the range of 5 to 20 milligrams, she's seeing improvements in many of her autistic patients, or I think she mentioned maybe 20 to 30 autistic patients, and that's a pretty good start right there. She encouraged me to get some and try it. It's not for sale here in Maine yet. So that's CBG. Now, when it comes to Delta 8 THC, what is Delta 8? So it's a variant, a molecular variant of THC that does occur naturally in the plant, but it occurs at very low levels. Its behavior in the body is going to be similar to Delta 9 THC. I do believe that some people may find qualitative differences, just like they do with CBN. CBN is an oxidative product of THC, or I should say, now just to clarify, Delta 9 THC. CBN also is an agonist at CB1 and CB2 receptors. Its behavior in the body is a little different than Delta 9 THC, but very similar. And some people notice that it feels different. A lot of people report it's more sedating. Some people think it's more awakening. Delta 8 is probably a little bit different, but similar. I wouldn't just claim that it's going to be less psychoactive. It probably would be for some people. I'm not sure why people are trying to isolate this or create it in the laboratory. I don't know that it has any real advantages over Delta 9 THC. It might though. I'm open-minded to that, but I'm pretty sure we don't have any solid evidence of that yet. So beware of marketing claims. And if anyone on the webinar tonight has direct experience with Delta 8 THC personally or with their clients or patients, I'd be very open to having you share those experiences. Okay, another one. I've got a question pertaining to humoral and cell-mediated immunity. I found a study from the 70s called Decrease in Cell-Mediated Immunity in Hashish Smokers, and some other more recent ones describing endocannabinoid system and immune function. Can you clarify the difference between the 2 forms of immunity and the implications cannabinoids have on wound healing, cancer, and the inflammatory response? So, first of all, the difference. We have 2 major types of immunity, 2 major categories. One is called innate immunity, and the other is called adaptive immunity. So innate immunity would be the immune cells that are circulating they're just on guard, they're warriors, they're ready to fight any invaders, gobble them up or kind of neutralize them. The other is adaptive immunity. This has to do with how our immune system learns some information about an invader and then specifically creates a response. So that's the adaptive response. And that includes antibody responses. So within adaptive immunity, we have an old term, humoral response, which is how we make antibodies, which are these little molecules that are specific to pathogens, and they kind of attach to the pathogens and disable them or prepare them to be destroyed, or even sometimes destroy them. And then the cell mediated has to do with the T cell response. And so a lot of you have heard about T cells and in immunodeficient conditions like AIDS, how certain types of T cell response becomes impaired, and then we're vulnerable to opportunistic infections. So that's probably too long of an explanation. But what happens with cannabis? So cannabis is immunomodulatory. It is true that if you take super high doses of THC in animal studies, you can suppress the immune system. And for a long time, people have said, well, cannabis suppresses the immune system. That's really not the case. If you look at the big picture, you can see that the cannabinoids will decrease certain cytokines or certain immune signaling molecules. We saw that tonight, right? A decrease in IL-6. But cannabis can also cause an increase in other immune signaling molecules. And there's typically a net anti-inflammatory effect. So it's decreasing the more pro-inflammatory signals. It's increasing the more anti-inflammatory or less inflammatory signals. And so we get this net anti-inflammatory effect. But I would not, it's a complex picture, and I would never assume that cannabis is going to suppress the immune function and make someone more susceptible to an infection. It's possible in certain situations, and actually I think probably the pathogen for which there's some data to support this, at least some animal data, would be Candida. Now, cannabis, the compounds in cannabis, remember, they have antibacterial qualities on their own. But there have been a couple of animal studies that have shown that when administering cannabinoids to mice, they're more vulnerable to candida infections, have a harder time fighting the infections. And some of those molecular mechanisms have been identified. And also, it doesn't seem like the cannabinoids themselves have much of an anti-candida effect. But that's just preliminary and still somewhat theoretical. Okay. I'm gonna keep cranking through these until we get another. Oh, you got a live one?
Yeah, there's quite a few that have just been texted in on the live questions tab on the spreadsheet.
Nice, thank you. Okay, so these are semi-live questions. I've heard over the years that a small number of women have a negative response emotionally from high CBD. Any comments or data that you can share about a female patient that's had this experience? Negative emotional response. Sorry, just put the text wrapping on here so I can see the whole thing. Estrogen dominant women. So yeah, I don't know that this is limited to women, Andrew. I think maybe if I think back at the people who have said that CBD causes irritation, kind of irritability or dysphoria, maybe more women than men have reported that, but certainly men have reported that as well. So I don't think I have a clear sense on exactly who is likely to get these side effects from CBD. I'm not sure. And as we heard tonight, from Q, is it the CBD or is it something else that's in the CBD? Or, who knows? Is it another plant constituent? Is it contaminant? There's just so many variables here. When treating metabolic disease and, I guess the other thing I want, before I move on from that last question, because it's bringing up the idea of sex differences, like are women and men going to respond to cannabis differently? And there's absolutely a scientific basis to answer that question. Yes, in general, it looks like women have lower moles in animal studies respond somewhat differently to cannabinoids than others. And so I think that we can assume that as we learn more and more about cannabis science, we're going to see these sex differences emerge in the human studies as well. They clearly showed up in some of the autism data that I presented previously on a webinar. Okay.
Hi, Dustin.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Andrew.
Hey, Andrew.
Yeah, I was actually pointing to the studies that you had on the emotional response to CBD, and if there was something in those studies that showed us something different that we see clinically in terms of the mechanics. I've had several patients that have reported it, so it's just
Yeah, again, I'm not sure. In my clinical experience, I'm not sure that I've really identified a trend yet about who is more likely to be irritated by CBD and what other kind of physiologic factors may be involved. I'm just not sure. There's CBD has a serotonergic effect, right? It stimulates the serotonin 5-HT1A receptor, and then it also inhibits the uptake of serotonin to a certain effect, a certain degree. And so some people are sensitive to serotonin. And some of the people that are sensitive to that effect may have overactive immune system in regard to their mast cell activity. And this is something that's becoming more commonly discussed in integrative and functional medicine, something called mast cell activation syndrome. Mast cells are these immune cells that secrete leukotrienes and histamines, and a lot of us, associate them with things like flushing or hives,
there you go.
allergic rhinitis.
Histamine.
Yep, but
Histamine response and bacteria, and
right.
that's what that correlates with what I've seen.
Yep.
Just wondering.
So yeah, there may be a mast cell. So I would say that people with mast cell activation syndrome, like if you can write with your fingernail on your arm and a minute later you can see the word in bright red, or if you're someone when you get emotional you turn bright red. It's probably happening not just on the skin and not just in your nose, but also in the gut and at the blood-brain barrier. And some of these people do really well with antihistamine medications or histamine stabilizing bioflavonoids, low histamine.
Oh, so there you go.
diets,
Maybe it's the
so forth.
bioflavonoids in the compounds, because there's a whole plant that I've seen in most of the cases.
Yeah, so that would be one. Again, that's theoretical. I don't think I've seen enough people with mast cell that are irritated by CBD, yet. But that would be one theoretical. Okay, let's move on to the next one. When treating metabolic disease and/or cancer, what is the relevancy of modulating or enhancing PPAR alpha receptor? How does cannabis play a role in this? And which other non-cannabis compounds can be taken to potentiate this effect? That's a good question. I'm wondering if you meant PPAR gamma. That's the one I know much more about, which seems to have a stronger role in pain and inflammation and metabolism. I'm not super familiar with PPAR alpha, even though I think I have a memory that some of the cannabinoids also do stimulate it. So for those of you that are new to this and are thinking, what's PPAR? What the hell is PPAR? Well, a lot of times we're thinking about cannabis and its compounds affecting the receptors that are on the surface of the cell. We got the cell membrane, we've got these G protein receptors that are like antenna, and the cannabinoids affect those. They do. That's where the CB1 receptor is, the CB2 receptor, the TRPV1 capsaicin receptor, and so forth. The cannabinoids also go inside the cell, all the way to the nucleus of the cell. The nucleus is where all the DNA is stored. That nucleus has its own membrane with another whole set of antenna, another set of receptors on that nuclear membrane. That's where the PPAR receptors are. And these receptors don't directly control cell function. They influence gene expression. So how the DNA is unpacked and then translated into RNA, which then gets translated into proteins, and the proteins then express their function. And so PPAR basically controls the expression of genes, and cannabinoids do affect those. I think we have a lot more to learn about that, but absolutely relevant in metabolic disease, pain, inflammation, and cancer.
Dr. Sulak, this is
Yes.
this is Jaime. I used
All right, Jaime.
Hi, how are you?
Good to hear your voice.
Thank you. You as well. So I just to draw on Dr. Ethan Russo's unified theory and just the research that's been happening on PEA and OEA. which seem to focus on PPAR alpha. That's where my questions stem from. That just to explain the context.
Okay. Well, I think I need to review some information about PPAR alpha. I'll take a look at that. Maybe we can go over some of that on the next webinar if I think that it's you know, somewhat clinically relevant. I'm looking for you, Jaime. Are you on here? Where are you?
Under Nicole?
I don't see your face.
No, no.
But that's all right. Maybe
We'll
next
see each other
time.
next time. Yeah.
Very nice to hear your voice.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, thank you. I will dig in more into the PPAR alpha. Okay,
Absolutely.
now we've got some questions from Nicole. What is your suggested protocol for Crohn's patients that have inflammation, anxiety, and cramping? And so that's a good question. You know, again, it's similar to many other inflammatory conditions. First question is, are they sleeping? Let's get them sleeping. Many of them are not. Let's help decrease pain and let things settle down a little bit. You know, with Crohn's disease has very much, and other types of inflammatory bowel disease, kind of like a snowballing effect. So as the inflammation gets worse, then they develop ulcers in the digestive tract. The blood from those ulcers is very irritating, and then it can cause more cramping, more motility, more diarrhea, more pain, more lack of sleep. The lack of sleep drives the inflammation, and it's you know, kind of this vicious cycle. So we want to interrupt that cycle. And so, you know, just to get a little bit more specific, how would I address someone with very active Crohn's disease? You know, I think another thing I just want to say is to validate them, right? It's pretty normal for someone like that to have anxiety and depression, and they don't have to think about those things that it's like their fault. It's part of the condition. A lot of people think inflammatory bowel disease, like Crohn's disease, is limited to the gut. But that's absolutely not the case. A huge percentage of people with these conditions also have arthritic symptoms and mental emotional symptoms, and that makes sense because of the inflammation. So what would I do? I'd use mostly you know, THC, CBD, acidic cannabinoids, get them sleeping, slowly titrate up a dose. It's hard to give a cookie cutter response, but I think, Nicole, that you could probably take that approach. You know, just kind of theoretically, I'd say, let's get you a nice THC oil, a nice whole spectrum CBD oil, and some type 2 cannabis flowers. And type 2 meaning a combination of CBD and THC. I'd have them start using THC at night. I'm assuming this is someone that is not familiar with cannabis, someone that's cannabis naive. Figure out the dose of THC that gets them sleeping, see how well they're doing after they're sleeping, and then layer in some daytime treatments with a combination of CBD and THC. I'd probably start at a 1-to-1 ratio, unless I had some reason for starting at a higher dose of CBD. And then maybe even before the oils during the day, just while they're working on their nighttime, I'd be having them take, you know, the cannabis tea, just drinking tea made from pea-size or 2 pea-sized pieces of that type 2 flower twice daily for the anti-inflammatory effect. And as you guys saw in a previous webinar, it seems like the benefit from the raw cannabis may take a little bit longer, maybe 2 to 4 weeks to really become evident. So I'd probably get them started on that early on. I've had several cases of inflammatory bowel disease where I've made these big plans for patients and they only do step 1 and then that's it. They come back, they're just taking THC before bed. They started sleeping better. Their inflammation went down, the cramping went down. They kind of broke that cycle and they're just so much better. So that might be enough. Okay. And then the next question is, what is your experience with the Picotti method of administration, the belly button? This is a new one, Nicole. Thank you for turning me on to something new. I am not experienced with naval administration of cannabinoids, but maybe there's really something to that. I'm not sure. If anyone knows anything about naval administration, please let me know. No, I mean, I'm open-minded. The navel is a very powerful area of the body. I address it frequently when I'm doing osteopathic treatment or a Chinese type of body work called Qi Ni Tsung, but not very often with cannabis. All right, you guys. We've got a good 15 minutes left. I'd love to hear from some of you live if anybody wants to ask a question. But for the next one, I am going to go back to our list of previously submitted questions. This is from Barry. I'm a harm reduction psychologist in Pennsylvania, and I'm excited and grateful to have a resource like you in your community to be able to offer my clients and their families the most accurate and up-to-date information on medical cannabis. Some of my clients have experienced positive results with medical cannabis in dealing with chronic pain issues. And then after a period of 6 months or so, the efficacy of the strains seems to diminish. I'm curious about why this might be happening. Is this a dosing issue, tolerance? Is it necessary to take a vacation from different strains and try others? Can they try other things to augment the effect? So yeah, great question, and something I think we don't talk about very often. It's clear that there's a tolerance issue, especially with THC in general. It can happen with CBD as well, but I think clinically we see it more often with THC. And that's why I developed that whole sensitization protocol, which involves 2 days of abstinence and then very careful titration with increased self-awareness to avoid that in the future and to find the optimal dose. But the question of building tolerance to a specific variety of cannabis, this is something that's been reported to me over and over again by patients throughout the years, where they can switch from one variety to another variety, keep the dose exactly the same, and regain the benefits. And so because of this, I usually encourage patients in general not to rely on a single variety of cannabis, but instead to say have 2 different varieties that they use before bed and 2 different ones that they use during the day, and to kind of switch them out from time to time. I think that's a good strategy. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see. Yeah, can they try other things to augment the effect? Oh, the other thing I want to remind people is that cannabis changes over time, right? So that jar in the cupboard that did one thing to you 6 months ago that now is at the bottom of the jar and you're still using it, that's a different medicine now, right? Some of it's decarb, some of the THC's turned into CBN, some of the terpenes have probably evaporated. There's probably other changes that we don't really fully understand. And so the medicine changes as it ages too. And I think it's okay to expect that to happen. All right, any live ones? Let's see, I see one little one that came across the chat. Any suggestions for the use of cannabis for hot flashes? I've had lots of women say that they think it's helping them care less about the hot flashes, maybe decreasing the intensity of the hot flashes a little bit. I haven't heard any astounding reports like, wow, cannabis just took away my hot flashes. I think getting better sleep is important, lowering stress. These things all contribute to hot flashes, but I'm not sure about a direct effect. As far as perimenopausal symptoms go, I have seen excellent results with a very safe treatment, which is topical progesterone. It's over the counter, it's bioidentical, usually a little bit goes a long way, and women usually really like the way that helps them feel. So let's go to another question on the previously submitted list. So many people have arthritis. What do you suggest for arthritis in the hands? Thank you. You are my favorite doctor of all. All right, Carol. Well, thank you too. So arthritis in the hands, it's good. I mean, as long as you have a preparation that can absorb pretty well and not leave your hands greasy all day, that's probably a small surface area and a pretty easy place to use a cannabis salve or a balm or a lotion, something along those lines. It's also very thin skin, not a lot of tissue there, so you're likely to get the medicine closer to the joints. So that would be the first thing that I would try for arthritis in the hands, would be the topical cannabis. And then also for arthritis, for the anti-inflammatory effects, start drinking the cannabis tea, as we've talked about before, finding some acidic cannabinoids, getting those into the diet. All right. I know that cannabis, this is from Surab. I know that cannabis is good for cancer pain, and 1-to-1 has been proven to be effective for the same. My question is, does it matter if the 1-to-1 is made using a sativa or indica? Great question. And let's just throw out the terms sativa and indica and just say, doesn't matter what variety of cannabis is used. to make them one-to-one. And there's different parts of the question. It has to do with the extraction and formulation method. So if it's using a method that's taking a lot of care to preserve the spectrum of compounds found in that specific variety of cannabis, then of course the end product is going to be very different. Very similar. And if you're using an extraction method like, say, distillation, that kind of disregards everything except for these single compounds, or for the most part, these single compounds like CBD and THC, then probably the variety of cannabis used for the starting material isn't going to make a big difference. But I think that cannabis just has so much to offer us in its varieties. There's so much there. People that inhale, that smoke or vaporize cannabis really get to know just how distinct these types of cannabis can be, and how wonderful that is at finding something that is specific for different times, different symptoms, it's in different stages of an illness or stages of recovery. That's it's just one of the real gifts of cannabis. So I think if we can pay attention to that and use extraction techniques that preserve those differences, it's gonna be really useful for us. Okay, another question. For female orgasm, is THC better than CBD? I expect yes. The authors in the study didn't comment on that, but I've yet to hear anyone claiming that CBD has helped their orgasm. Please chime in if you have found this, and don't be bashful. It's typically, was there a comment from my live audience here in the office? Nope. No, I have someone else here that says it doesn't help either. It's typically, this is from another one. Oh, Becca Williams, are you here? Did you want to ask something live, Becca? Well, I'll read the question, but if you want to chime in, just send a note over to Simone. It's typically believed that THC hinders the dream state. Since dreams most notably occur during the presence of rapid eye movement stage, do we know what THC is doing to hinder the dream state? So there's a little research on this. I think we need more, but the research is that a high dose of, well, first of all, THC can suppress the recall of dreams. That doesn't mean that it's suppressing REM sleep. Okay, and so if you use THC at a dose, say in PTSD, where it's suppressing dream recall and making it so nightmares are not waking people up, you can use it at a dose where it's not disturbing the architecture of the sleep, meaning people continue to have REM sleep. Now, you can use enough THC to disrupt sleep architecture, but it has to be a lot. For example, there was a study in healthy people that did not have sleep problems, and it was shown that gradually increasing the dose of a pharmaceutical THC, when they got to the dose that made them feel stoned or slow the next morning, a dose that impaired their cognitive tests the next morning, that dose did not disturb their REM sleep. Now, most of the time in a clinical situation, we're titrating before bed THC dose to the level of getting good sleep, but not waking up feeling stoned. So I think that if we stick with that kind of strategy, it's very unlikely that we're going to disturb sleep architecture and prevent REM sleep. REM sleep is very important. It's a time when we make these broad associations between memories that we've stored from that previous days. So, for example, if we see something in our environment, like a plant, and it reminds us of something common, like, oh, my house plants at home also look like they need water, just like my plants in the office. I better water them both. But it's during REM sleep when we make more broad associations, like, oh, the plants in my office need watering, and that reminds me of like a time in my life when I felt undernourished or underloved, and I was withering like a plant, and those broad associations do kind of contribute to our overall wisdom in dealing with the world. REM sleep is very important for that kind of emotional resilience and processing and approach to the next day, and so we don't want to suppress that. I don't think that cannabis does when used appropriately. Okay, let's see. We got time for at least one more, so let's dig in. Becca, I see you now, but I know you're muted. Can I have a thumbs up? Did that answer your question? Okay, I got the nod. Good. All right.
We have a live question.
Oh, perfect. Thanks, Simone.
Go ahead, Teresa.
Hi, I had a question. I'm a nurse massage therapist and I work with oncology patients, and there's a lot of interest in using topical applications for neuropathy and for pain, and usually chemo-induced neuropathy. And I'm wondering, have you found it effective? Should it be a THC CBD concoction, or should it be one or the other? And what is the dose?
Of the topical, what is the dose of the topical?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great questions. So, first of all, a lot of patients over the decade I've been in practice have reported that topicals work for pain, including neuropathic pain. They have diabetic neuropathy, they rub it on their feet, the burning goes away for a few hours. It feels very soothing. The vast majority of my positive reports have come from topicals based on THC.
Okay.
But I've been getting more and more positive reports about CBD topicals over the last couple of years. And it's very likely that these two work in quite different ways. So I would say that if someone doesn't respond to THC, it'd be very a good idea to try CBD and vice versa. As far as the dose or the potency, in my opinion, the more potent, the better. It's just going to be more expensive. But I think 0.5% is probably the lower end of the spectrum. 1% and 2% creams or salves are probably a potency that's more likely to be very effective. But I do want to comment that in that patient population, I don't think we should just be chasing around the neuropathic pain and suppressing it for a couple hours with a topical, because those nerves are going to continue to be damaged. And what we want to do is protect the nerves from further damage. Now, there's animal studies that have shown that, well, so basically in animal studies, the models of neuropathy are typically the use of these same chemotherapy agents that we use in people because they're so good at producing neuropathy, right? And so in animal studies that have looked at preventing the development of neuropathy or preventing the progression of neuropathy, and for that purpose, I would recommend more of a systemic application, not just a topical application.
Cool. Thank
All right,
you.
thanks. That was a great question. Okay, and I just saw one little one on here that says, Dr. Sulak, do you think CO2 extraction is better than ethanol for cannabis? No, I don't. I think ethanol is better than CO2. And I'm not trying to knock one or the other. I think that they all have their place. But from everything that I've seen, it looks like ethanol can do a more full spectrum extraction than CO2. All right, well, it is 8:30. It's right on time here. I'll just take a quick look because I only skipped a few of the previously submitted questions. Let's see if there's one that's really relevant here, really exciting to talk about. Yes, some of them can be found in the curriculum. So like, are there contraindications to taking cannabis with other medications? Do you have a recommended protocol for fibromyalgia? So, the answer to that first one is see the webinar or just go to healer.com in the free area and not see the webinar, see the training program, but also in the free section of healer.com, we have the provider handout, something that people are encouraged to bring to, say, their primary care provider and show them so they can get some basic information about cannabis. And cannabis has a very mild antihypertensive effect. Actually, I should say THC does. CBD actually does the opposite. It can raise blood pressure a little bit. So if someone was kind of like already just about overdosing on their blood pressure medications and had very low blood pressure, and then they added THC to that, they might get too low and feel a little dizzy or faint or something, but otherwise no big deal. And recommended protocol for fibromyalgia, very similar to what we talked about with Crohn's, but again, it's treat the patient, don't treat the diagnosis. And let's see. Yes, a question about automobiles, just driving under the influence. Since cannabis stays detectable in our body for 60 days, even though the effects are only for a few hours. Have any reliable methods to test for real DUI, have they been established? Yes, they've been established. It's the roadside sobriety test, or the more in-depth test that a drug recognition expert can perform. Sometimes they have like mobile homes that they can administer the test in, where the floor is level, because doing it on the side of the road where you might be on a slant or something creates quite an inaccurate test. So there's absolutely methods for detecting impairment that are used for other drugs that are applicable to cannabis. They're far from perfect, but I don't think we need anything special from cannabis. It's been shown many times, including in a recent study that I intentionally did not include tonight because it's not anything new. It's been shown many times that blood levels of THC do not correlate with impairment. You could have someone who's impaired that has a level of like 2 nanograms per, I think it's per deciliter, might be milliliter, deciliter, I think. You could have someone that's not impaired at all who has a level of 20 nanograms per deciliter. So there's really no correlation there. And some states, of course, have that as a kind of a per se standard, where if you're caught and you have a blood level above a certain point, that you're defined as impaired. Now, the other problem with people being persecuted for driving with THC in their blood is that a lot of people who are using cannabis for medical purposes have neurologic conditions and would fail the roadside sobriety test on their best of days. And of course, if they have to go to court around that problem, then hopefully their doctor will show up to testify for them. So it's not a perfect test. And then we have one left here. I have a client who has been taking RSO, and it has been helpful in managing her emotional reactivity. She has PTSD. She was recently advised to gradually decrease her use of this and move towards a 1-to-1 THC CBD ratio. Can you elaborate on why this might be indicated? Well, first of all, if someone's doing really well, then I would say, don't change it. Keep it going for a while. Personally, I think that hash oil is very hard to accurately dose. It's easy to overdose. It can be expensive. I'm not sure how much she was taking. I would expect a 1-to-1 oil that's easily dosable by the drop to be a little bit more convenient than trying to squeeze something out of a tube and get the right amount and eat it, and risking having a really bad day because you got too much of it. So maybe that was why, just more practical reasons and not a dosing reason. But I reserve judgment. I've seen people do all sorts of things with cannabis, things that I would expect not to work very well and that work great. And so maybe her hash oil technique is just right for her. Well, looks like it's 8:35. I think we've done pretty well tonight. You guys seem fairly happy. What a good looking crew we have on here. Just taking a peek at everyone. If we have anything else that anyone wants to hear about tonight, I will stick around for a few more minutes. Send a message right now. Otherwise, thank you so much for being a part of this.
We have a live question.
Okay, we got one last one, the icing on the cake. Let's do it.
Go ahead, Dwayne.
I have a friend that has prostate cancer. He's going to undergo proton therapy in about 2 weeks, and he wanted to know about anti-inflammatory properties of cannabis. And I told him that I was pretty sure it was, because his doctor says, well, you can't take any anti-inflammatories. But, with all the terpenes and so forth associated with full spectrum cannabis, I'm assuming that, yes, it is anti-inflammatory. And I just wanted your input on that so I could pass it on.
Sure. So it's really hard to know. I mean, the only evidence we have that can kind of inform that question of, would cannabis kind of augment proton therapy for prostate cancer? Would it decrease its efficacy, or would it have no effect? The only evidence we really have for that is in brain cancer types of a study in rodents, where it was shown that THC and CBD strongly enhanced the effect of radiation therapy, and not just making it more effective at killing the cancer, but also protecting the healthy cells around the cancer. And so, you know, and I know that the radiation does cause some inflammation. That inflammation can contribute to the destruction of the cancer, but there's so many other potential mechanisms by which the cannabinoids could enhance the benefits of the proton therapy. So there's no right answer. I would say it's not a strong contraindication. I wouldn't say like stop it for sure. There's no evidence to support that. If it were me, I would probably continue to take it while receiving the proton therapy. You know, do you know, is he doing like a super high dose, or is he just doing a quality of life type of a dose?
Well, he's got a Gleason of 8, so but he's going to take 44 treatments. So.
Oh no, but not the dose of radiation, but the dose of cannabis. Is he doing like a heroic amount of cannabis?
Well, I don't know yet. He just got his card. He lives in Maryland, and he wants to start on that, but he doesn't know if he can with the proton.
Yeah,
therapy.
I you know, it's hard to know, but if it were me and my prostate and I was facing that type of treatment, I would absolutely want cannabis in my system at the time to protect my healthy cells from the effects of the radiation and to potentially sensitize the cancer cells to the effects of the radiation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Lots of questions that are hard to answer. I hope I do my best saying I don't know, even though sometimes I don't use those exact words. I want you to know that there's a lot that I don't know and that we don't know, and it's hard to know. Yet there's still people that need to make decisions about their treatment and their lives and their lifestyles without knowing. And so a lot of times there's just no right or wrong answer, and a lot of us have to go inside, find our internal compass. You know, yes, it can be informed by some of this limited scientific information, but I would, you know, I just so value people's personal preference and their intuition and their gut instinct when they're sitting with me in the clinic. I often go with that. All right. Well, thank you all so much for another nice webinar. I love having you here. I feel great about this. I will see you next month. Have a great May.